If you want to get rid of all the ads, just choose the David McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts, and you'll hear us without any clutter or noise or ads. Lovely, John.
Beautiful.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time. This podcast, we're going to talk about why Ireland might be wealthy, but it doesn't feel wealthy. Why, John, Irish people are rich, but we can feel poor at the same time.
Do you know what, Mac? Let's talk about that. Will you turn off your boombox, though?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I tell you, I'm listening with John. Look, I'm listening to...
Jesus.
I'm listening to Lana Del Rey.
I love Lana Del Rey.
Me too. And when I am reading American sociology, I have to listen to Lana Del Rey.
Right.
Because she brings me to America. Everything about her is American, right? And I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called it's The Fourth Turning is Here by Neil Howe.
Neil Howe, brilliant.
His new book, right, which is 25 years after he published The Fourth Turning. He said the fourth turning
25 years ago?
Yeah.
Wow.
The fourth turning is here. What the seasons of history tell us about how and when this crisis will end, right? And it's an amazing book. I'm writing a blurb for it. So I'm reading it at the moment. It's not published, I think, until July. It is outstanding.
Got to get him on the show.
We'll definitely get him on the show. Oh, yeah. No, we definitely, no. I spoke to Neil the other day. He said, yeah, he'll be on the show. But
brilliant.
Obviously, the fourth turning is his big idea is that history repeats itself in these cycles of between 80 and 100 years. He calls them seculums, which is a Roman word.
Yeah.
And the idea is that every cycle goes broadly in a similar fashion. And it's basically one long lifetime. And he breaks these cycles up into periods of 20 years. So 4 periods of 20 years.
And they're punctuated by events.
They're punctuated by events. So the idea is he's trying to make the point, which I believe is that history repeats itself constantly. Right? And you see the same type of trends in various different... So there's 4 turnings. That's why it's called the fourth turning. The first turning is when, after a crisis, a society emerges out of the crisis. It's the sort of the takeoff. And then he has this period called awakenings, right? And then he has degeneration, and then he has crisis, and then we start again. Right?
So the further you get from that event, the weaker the memory?
It's a combination of weaker memory. It's also how generations change and how generations... Right. So basically, it's fascinating. You and I experience 2023 in a completely different way to somebody who's 20 years old, right?
Yeah,
So we live through the same historical period, but we experience it in a profoundly different way.
And therefore have a different attitude towards it.
Totally different attitude. Yeah. And of course, what forms us in many ways, as we get older, it's remember we talked about Beckett, right?
Yes, we did.
And Beckett was talking about looking back on his life. Krapp's last tape is about a guy looking back on his life, and he's meditating about the meaning of life and do we change? And how is kind of Beckettian in his approach, which is like that we do change over time, right? And as we get older and as we mature into society, we experience the society different. And a lot of the ways our views are formed, like, so for example, we're part of, Neil Howe came up with the expression millennial. He's the guy who came up with it.
Okay,
right. I mean, that's his claim to fame,
Yeah.
It's a pretty good claim to fame. So the millennials are people born between 1982 and 2000, right? So the first millennials came of age in the millennial, i.e. they became 18.
Yeah.
So that's why they're called millennials. We, of course, are Gen Xers, John. Did you know that? And we're kind of, the really unfortunate, we're kind of a pathetic generation. We haven't really done much.
Really? I'm not sure about that.
No, but if you look in politics and things, we're not that well represented. We're kind of much more, and one of the things he talks about is the way in which our generation were not mollycoddled as children. We were actually, the Americans called them latch door kids. We were kind of left to our own devices.
Absolutely. We had a hard upbringing out in our bare feet.
Out in our bare feet, exactly.
Walking 20 miles to school.
No, but you know this idea now that, children are mollycoddled.
Yeah,
and you're so special and this, that, and the other. What he says is that, in America in particular, our generation were not particularly mollycoddled. In fact, they came of age, because these children came of age when the boomers were all divorcing, when there was a hell lot of alcoholism, when it was a much more degenerate country. the United States in the 70s and 80s, right? When we were little kids, okay? That we were kind of like an afterthought, right? Whereas the what he talks about, the millennials were much more mollycoddled, much more, they were told they were great.
Yeah.
And
but also it was the recessions of the 80s, particularly here. It was and in the UK, it's the recessions of the 80s and the strikes and
all that stuff. All that good stuff. All that stuff.
It was hard going, and you just had to get on with it.
His theory, his overarching theory, right, is that...
Sorry, by the way, I can almost feel all their eyes being raised to heaven there by all the younger generation. Oh, there they go.
There they go again. There they go again. It's like Monty Python. I was poor. You were poorer. We had nought. Lived on the side of the road. Anyway, his point is the fourth turning. So the crisis period is here now, right? So he starts at 1945. So he breaks down the American world, and he does it for various different things. But, 1945 to the assassination of JFK is this new American high, right? Then 1963 to about 1985 is the awakening period. Then 1985 to the 2007 crash is what he would call almost like a degeneration period. And then you get the crisis, which is we're living through now. And then, of course, the society then rebuilds itself and reforms itself. And he's predicting a new, very innovative and quite upbeat future after this crisis goes through. So
that's assuming that we get through the crisis.
Well, he says we always get through the crisis.
Okay.
And
well, that's very
the crisis galvanizes people socially. So he makes the point that, the 1950s in the United States was an extreme decade of volunteerism, social uplift. It was a very, very humanitarian decade.
Yeah.
It was the closest thing the Americans ever got to socialism was in the 1950s.
Yeah, okay.
So all that sort of stuff. And he says that's a function of what happened after the war. Interestingly, most economists predicted after the Second World War that America would go into a depression, a Great Depression, right?
Okay.
Because the demand from the war abated. So the demand for trucks, tanks and And most economists said we will go into a massive recession. But what actually happened was Americans did the opposite. They became unbelievably upbeat about them. They started having babies, the baby boomers. That's where they had all the babies, right? And so it's fascinating. Anyway, and the reason I'm listening to Lana Del Rey is
Lana Del Rey,
I am in America, in my head at the moment. I am in America. That's not where I was, and I want to talk about Ireland. Last Tuesday, I was on the 8:20. I wouldn't call it an express because that would be a little bit too glorious description. The 8:20 Dunleary to Drogheda train.
Right.
Okay. And the 8:20 Dunleary to Drogheda train, if anybody knows about Irish railways, is a bizarre experience. So I'm on the Dunleary to Drogheda train, on my way to Drogheda.
Yeah.
Interesting town, by the way. Interesting town. And I realize the train's going very slowly. And then, of course, you get the... you just go, no,
bing
it's
bong.
Bing bong, Irish rail, Actually, in fact, the funniest thing on Irish rail, I'll tell you about the story. I was on a train from Cork to Dublin about 8 years ago, and the train stopped at Kildare.
Yeah.
And there was a problem. Sorry, there's a problem on the line, la, 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 la. We were all waiting for the next train. And after about an hour, everyone's got really pissed off.
As you would.
Ding dong. The next train to Dublin is a bus. The fucking bus. It's come up. It's like all this. The next train to Dublin is a bus. Anyway.
Go on. We're on our way to Drogheda.
We're on our way to Drogheda. And at Lansdowne Road, train stops. And man comes on, he says, there's been an accident in the train in front of us. And they're waiting for an ambulance. Somebody got sick, obviously, had an episode. Now, the problem in Ireland is there's only 2 tracks. So if the dart in front of you stops, every single train
behind
from Dublin to Rosslare stops. Because there's only 2 tracks.
But that's the norm, though, isn't it?
No, every other country have 3 tracks. So you have a high-speed track and you have a suburban track.
Right, okay.
So if you look at every other country that you go to, we'll always have a 3rd track so you can pass out other trains.
Right.
So you don't get stuck. Right? Remember that big? Did you remember when the Russians invaded Ukraine? There was a big long line of Russian tanks.
Yeah.
Just in one road, and the Ukrainians. That's the Irish train system for you, right?
Right.
So there's no 3rd lane, so they can't pass them out.
No hard shoulder.
There's no hard shoulder, so there's no way you can have an express train,
right?
Because we haven't built the infrastructure. So I'm sitting there, and quite interesting about being on trains is that when trains stop, people start to get nervous and they start to chat. I've always noticed this, right? And there was a lot of chat about when the next thing's coming. And what was fascinated me was that there were so many foreigners on the train.
Right.
People speaking some Slavic language, Latin languages, it's a bit of Urdu, a lot of Indians, all that sort of stuff, right? And it struck me then that, working Ireland is cosmopolitan, it's outward, it's multicultural, it's multi-talented, it's the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas infrastructure Ireland, the trains wouldn't be out of place from the 1950s. So I was trying to understand why in Ireland, and I've been trying to figure this out for quite some time, is the country rich on paper? But it doesn't feel rich. It doesn't feel like a wealthy country. When you go to a wealthy country, and I'm talking about the Germanys and the Norways of this world, right? They feel hassle-free. It feels that they've figured out how to get from A to B. They've figured out housing. They've figured out how to build properly. So a wealthy country feels wealthy.
Yeah.
Whereas Ireland feels as if it's straining at the leash all the time, that everything's jerry-built and there's bottlenecks everywhere. And, there's supply problems and there's housing problems and there's, everything feels like it's unpermanent.
Yeah.
So I was on the train contemplating this as I was waiting for the train to start, which did actually restart about an hour later.
Right.
And I did eventually get to my destination. But when I was on the train, I was thinking, why is it that Irish people can be rich and poor at the same time? You can actually, on paper, have a decent wage, but feel poor. And the reason is because our demand in the economy is so much greater than supply. So what has happened in Ireland, and again, lots and lots of people on the train explain this to you, right? What has happened in Ireland is in most countries, demand, it's a bit of an economics lesson, John. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply.
Yep.
So aggregate demand is when you add up all the demands of the economy, put them all together, that's aggregate demand. And aggregate supply is when you add up all the supply in the economy,
Sure.
put it all together, right?
Yeah.
In most countries, they broadly even out. It's what economists call equilibrium. So you get to a point where there's no tendency for change, right? Now, lots of people are studying economics. It's basically the demand, the supply curve meet and the price is stable. Now, if your demand curve shifts, right, because there's far too much demand, and your supply curve remains rigid because you don't build anything new or you don't build quick enough, you get massive inflation. This is the oldest trick in the book, right? Okay. And I thought, why is this? And the reason is the following, is that Ireland has plugged itself into a global economy, right? So when you are on the trains in Dublin or whatever, you're seeing people working for Google and Facebook and the technology companies and the pharma companies and all these, right? So we have demand that is actually requisite from a different country. We have bits of American demand here, but we have Irish supply.
I understand. Yeah.
For example, if you go to Germany, you don't have this, right?
Yeah.
So the Irish economic model has been to piggyback on American prowess, American dynamism, American technology. What that has done is it's created enormous opportunities for people who've worked in the DFI, direct foreign investment community, right? About 250,000 people earning very good wages working for American companies. But what that has done is that it has meant that all this demand is cascading down on a country with a fixed supply. So, for example, we haven't built a railway service, right, with more than 2 lines.
Yeah.
Think about it, right? The Dublin commuter train has 2 lines, right? The Dart that I got in the other day, that line, Dublin, Dunleary to Dublin, right, was built before the famine.
Right, yeah.
It is the oldest suburban rail network in the world. It hasn't been upgraded.
Yeah.
Right? It hasn't been upgraded since then.
This reminds me of, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah, exactly.
But here's the thing, though. I mean, so we have plugged in, as you say,
to the world,
to a global economy, which is a great thing.
It is a great thing.
And we've benefited hugely from it. But it was almost on the proviso that we plug into that and then upgrade
You're
everything.
absolutely right.
So we haven't done that.
So that's
why is that?
So that's why our GDP figures look great. And even when you take out, people say Irish people have the highest income and but it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah.
So when you go to Germany, it feels rich.
Yeah.
Things work and it's planned and it's figured out, right? And the reason is it's like indigestion. It's as if we ate 2 steak dinners and chips, right?
Yeah.
And now we're trying to digest everything. So we grabbed all this demand from outside. So we have loads of foreign workers, loads of foreign capital, all that sort of good stuff here, right? But we haven't responded. We're trying to digest all the time. And it's this, we're constantly have this feel of indigestion. And economic indigestion manifests itself as house prices going through the roof, of traffic, tailbacks, hassle, all that sort of thing. Day-to-day life just being difficult, right? It's as if we're trying to figure things out now.
So what's the economic rennies then?
Well, that's exactly. I like the way you're talking. Economic. This is obviously 2 middle-aged men with bad bags.
Yeah, that's true, actually.
In fact, I was given a bottle of Gaviscon for a present by my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law from the north.
Yeah.
He regularly gives me bottles of Gaviscon. He says, "You're at that age, right?" So imagine the economy is me, okay, right, with a bad bag. But what you're basically has happened is we need our supply to respond. Now, when I say our supply, we need houses, we need roads, we need infrastructure. This is what we need, right? But just take the housing market, John. This is where it's the most acute. Irish house costs are 94% above the EU average.
Jesus, right.
94%.
Okay.
So they're almost double EU, right? Property prices have risen 130%. Sorry, property prices have risen 130% since, there's my bag going.
Yeah. Give that man some Rennie.
Give that man Property prices have gone up 130% since 2013, right?
Yeah.
There is no supply. Think about it. At one point last year, according to Daft, there were just 2,500 houses available to rent in the whole country. In the whole country, okay? Right. Last August, there was only 716 homes available to rent in Ireland. Now, this is what's happening. 700 homes.
This is what indigestion looks like.
This is what indigestion looks like, right? And you've got this extraordinary economy that is powering ahead. The population is going to be above 5 million for the first time since 1851. We've had a massive 7.6% increase in population since 2016. This is 2016. This is phenomenal, right? So people are coming in, we're having babies, right? But we've no infrastructure because the supply hasn't responded. So in a way to understand the dilemma, you know, and my kids, Cal asked me, look, Dad, look, how does this work?
Yeah.
On paper, we're rich. But in practice, everything disappears because everything's so expensive. And I was trying to explain to him, this is what the problem is. We have the demand of Connecticut and the infrastructure of Albania. And that is not a good place to be. So we have to keep building.
So the thing is, though, that we spoke the other day about cathedral thinking, long-term thinking, and all that kind of stuff. So we need to talk about how we move on from this, how we solve this indigestion.
We do.
Let's talk about that after this.
Okay.
So we have economic indigestion. How are we going to solve this?
So for the first time in Irish economic history, the problem is not insufficient demand, it's too much demand. So the problem in economics in Ireland, all through our lifetime, up until very recently, was there wasn't enough demand, and that materialized in very high levels of unemployment, right? Now we have too much demand, very low levels of unemployment. We're absorbing in immigrants to fill the jobs that are there. But the state or the organs of the state have not opened up the economy in such a way as to allow, for example, homes to be built. So it's all related to, as you said, what we did last time. It's this idea of you need to build infrastructure which is requisite to or demanded by or required by the level of demand. So what we've done now everything Ireland does from here on in for the next 2 decades has to be supply. We have more than enough demand. All small countries have always wanted to overcome what I call the tyranny of geography or the tyranny of size. We have managed to do that. So typically a small country, their growth rate is always capped by the size of their market. And our market's very small, so our growth rate is going to be very small. What we have done is we've done a great Houdini act by actually tapping into the American and the EU, in fairness, markets. So we've created a market for ourselves, not of 300 million in the EU, but 300 million in the EU plus 300 million in America.
Yeah.
So we're servicing a market of 600 million. And the demand consequences of that are what we feel in Ireland, which is everything seems to be out of control.
So
because it is actually out of control.
Yeah, so this is like a super hyped up marketing department that are doing brilliantly. Sales guys are out there and but then the operations lads in the back.
There's no product. It's like, oh shite. We're after booking £1 million of sales, but we've no product. That's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And the product we have therefore is incredibly expensive.
Yes.
It's called inflation.
Yeah.
So what we need to do now, and all our economic efforts now for the next, I think, decades, have to be supply, supply, supply. Because we've only got two opportunities here. We've got a choice, right? Either we can crush demand, and by that means you bring on a recession, you precipitate a crisis, you allow large parts of the economy to fail, you embrace poverty, right?
Jesus,
that's the only thing you can do to bring down demand.
That's the
so
economic suicide.
So you've got
self-harming.
It's like self-harming. So you don't want to do that. So what you have to do is you have to grasp the nettle on the supply side. And that means long-term infrastructural projects, number one, but also short-term. So for example, in building, change the way in which we build things. Change the way in which we go about building homes, right? We have to take the best practices from abroad. And if they are homes built in factories and assembled on site, do it.
Yeah.
That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
Now, the problem there is there's so many vested interests in construction that don't want to do this, right?
Yeah.
So any government, and we're going to be talking about governments and change and what have you, right? But any government that comes in needs to understand what is now required of it. And what is now required of it is to bulldoze through any sort of bottlenecks in supply. Because if we don't do that, the economy will continue to get wealthy on paper, but people will continue to be unbelievably stressed in reality because they will have the incomes of a rich country, but the infrastructure of a poor country. And it's the infrastructure that actually counts in the end, right? That's what makes life worth living. That's why when you go to those wealthier countries in Europe, everything seems to work because they're constantly building. I remember years ago living in Belgium. Many people would say Belgium is not really the model for any sort of extraordinary lifestyle. Belgium's an amazing lifestyle. And I was intrigued that there was a railway being built in the middle of a motorway. This was in the late 80s. And I was on a train, and beside me, they were building a motorway and a train track in the middle of the motorway.
Right.
And I thought in my Irish head, isn't that really stupid? You can either get the train or the car.
Yeah.
But you don't need both. But of course, they said, no, we need both. So people have a choice. So it's like, for example, Dublin Port Tunnel. Remember the big yoke?
Yeah.
The big screwdriver we had? Why did we give it back? We should have just kept building tunnels all over the place. Like when you start building infrastructure, I was just thinking...
We gave it back? Who did we give it back to?
No, we only took it to build the Port Tunnel. Why did we not actually put a long lease on that and say, okay, why don't we build a metro now?
Yeah.
We've already started building the tunnel. We know how to do it. I was in the Dublin Port Tunnel the other day, coming back from the airport, and I was thinking, why didn't the people who built the Dublin Port Tunnel build a railway in the middle of it? Just a third lane.
Yeah.
While you were doing it. And then you would have had the metro to the airport. Side by side with the tunnel.
Yeah.
And it would have been done. It's that idea of building not for today, but building for tomorrow. Building not for 4 million people, but building for 6 million people. Or, as we said before in the podcast, take the figure of 10 million. An island of 10 million people, a united island of 10 million people in 2050, and build for that.
All right. What's the priority? What's the number one priority? What would you start with?
Well, I mean, the main thing is to vote for the people that seem to get this.
We're non-political here, so...
No, but I mean, non-political, but I mean, there must be a political party that says, hold on a second, I see what's going on here.
Yeah.
What's going on here, we have too much demand, we have enough supply, The people who are in charge of supply are creating bottlenecks. Why? Because they're getting very, very rich on it. Because, as I said, when the demand curve shifts and the supply curve doesn't, the people who own the supply get very, very rich. And identify that as the problem. Not a class warfare. Not like it's landlords versus tenants, right? It sells, but it doesn't fix the problem, right? The problem is that at certain areas, there are enormous bottlenecks, the housing market being the most obvious one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need to go out and quiz our political masters, John, so to speak. But have you analysed the problem?
Yeah. You prioritize.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you actually think is going on here? When you are now, you've been in power, you've been in opposition, you're in the Dáil, you're a civic-minded person, you're the type of person who has decided to become a politician. What do you think is wrong? Now, typically what will happen is they'll defend and say, well, this is right and this. They'll check things out.
And we have been doing this and that and all the rest.
Yeah, but you've got to say, look,
it's not working.
I'm cool with that. Look, this is not aggressive, right? This is like two citizens sitting in a bar. What do you think is wrong? And if they conclude, look, we have this demand problem, which gives us these amazingly glittering statistics, ideas, comparators with the rest of the world, right? Ireland is the best at this, the second best at that, the richest at right?
Yeah.
And somebody says, we have all these, but I can see what's going on here. We've bitten off more than we can chew. And because economics is only driven by GDP, it all looks good. But the average citizen, when they get back into their house, when they actually get from the commute and they get back into their jerry-built starter home, where they can hear their neighbours riding next door. Okay?
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Fair, right? And they're knackered and their bills are going up and their mortgages are going up and their tax rate seems to be very, very high vis-a-vis their mates who are in Australia or in Canada. And they know, and they're on a WhatsApp group to their mates in Canada or in Australia, and their mates are saying, well, you know, my tax rate is this, that, and the other, and I've got this lifestyle. And they're sitting in Ireland and they're thinking, okay, I've got a good job. My career is going well. On paper, everything is fine. But I'm commuting. I'm in traffic. My childcare's gone through the roof. I have no money at the end of the week. The starter home I bought that costs multiples of starter homes in other countries is jerry-built in an estate with no infrastructure. I'm thinking, how the fuck did this happen? Right? That's reality for thousands, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, it is.
And for those people in this democracy, just have to go and say, okay, who is speaking my language? Who feels what I'm feeling? Who understands what I'm going through? That yes, I can have 60 grand a year, 70 grand a year, right? Well above the average wage, but I feel poor. And it's that idea of joining up the dots. That's what we need to do all the time. And then if somebody says, I know what the problem is here, but it's going to take us 10 years to fix or 15 years to fix, at least you know they're thinking in the right way. Whereas somebody says, oh, well, I did this and I did that, you know, and look, haven't I great? Look at all the stuff I did for you. You're still sitting in the kitchen in your starter home with no money at the end of the month, even though objectively you look very, very rich. And the political class have to see that and have to respond to this. And the key is, and I come back to it's economics 101, it's your demand curve has shifted and your supply curve remains the same. So you shift the supply curve and that means attacking vested interests.